Yeah, so looks like we'll get underway in a second. You said we're still missing two people?
Yeah, one's joining back in right now.
Okay, all right, we'll get started then. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a music theory workshop that we're running through the Craft Center. I'm Rahul Bhat. I'm a student here at NC State, and I'll give you guys a little bit more information about myself in a second. But first, a couple little things. To start with, I plan on this little workshop being really interactive, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. The system we're going off of right now is, since there shouldn't be too many of you, you can just speak up into your microphone. If it turns out a lot of people are all trying to talk at once, then I guess we'll switch to typing in chat instead, but we'll work with that as we get there. And as a little disclaimer, I apologize. My wonderful slides I had ready got deleted, so I had to have a last minute workaround. So there's not going to be too much in the slides, but I promise you're still going to learn everything that I had planned. Let me think, any other little bits and pieces? Oh yeah, so the slides themselves, I plan on sending out to all of you as soon as, well, sometime after the workshop has ended, so you'll have those for yourself. One thing I'd like all of you, if you don't already have on you right now, is please grab a writing utensil and something to write on. Like even if it's an iPad or something like that, just something that you can do a couple of written exercises on. Reason being is we're going to probably look at some scale exercises, some rhythm exercises, and just I want you guys to be able to write stuff down. And I thought I'd let you know a little bit beforehand so that you don't have to scramble for paper and pen. So if you could get that ready whenever, that would be great.
Also, we are recording this meeting, so if for whatever reason your Wi-Fi gets messed up or you have to leave, we can send you the recording so you don't miss out.
Lauren, you're the one recording that, right? I don't have to do anything from my end?
No, Katie's recording it on the computer you're on, but she'll deal with it all, so you're good.
Okay, good. All right, so it looks like we're ready to go then. Trying to think, any last little things? No. Okay, I'm gonna have to figure out, I'm not used to this, so let's see if I can pull up some slides eventually.
You're good.
All right. Yeah, once again, welcome to an introduction to music theory, a little-ish 2-hour workshop. We'll be taking a break about halfway through, or depending on how we do, I'll be checking time. Aside from that, before we really dive in, if anyone wants to just yell out real quick, what made you choose or decide to take this workshop out of curiosity? What do you plan on gaining? What about it interested you?
Well, I just bought a guitar and I haven't done anything music ever in my life. Like, I don't know any instruments, never was in band. So I figured this would be a good place to start and get a good understanding of everything.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. I'm glad you actually bring that up, that you have a guitar. And while I do have a guitar too, this little workshop is for any and all instruments. So this is a good place to start if you want to learn something about music just in general. There's, of course, in the description for the class, there's absolutely no need to, like, there's no requirements for having an instrument on hand. The reason I have one is so I can actually show you what I'm talking about. But yeah, so I'm glad that you bought a new guitar and you're interested. Little plug on the side is I'm normally, like I said, I'll get into who I am and what I do here at the Craft Center in a bit, but part of that is I normally teach guitar classes here at the Craft Center. So if any of you are ever interested in that kind of thing, if we're able to offer that in the fall or spring, I will probably be teaching. So little side anecdote right there, but also to confirm, all of you are seeing the slideshow presentation right now, right? Not my face?
You're good, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct. You're good.
All right, we'll take one or two more. Anyone else want to go ahead and tell us why you were interested in learning something about music theory?
Well, I
I'm
took music about, I'm not going to tell you how long ago it's been, but I hadn't had a piano up until recently, and I'm thinking about starting playing the thing, and I've also been thinking about purchasing a ukulele, but
Hmm.
I thought maybe this might help me move into a direction.
Yeah, no, that is, again, very similarly so. This is a great place to start. So, while I didn't address it on the last person who went ahead, I will address it now. Obviously, I'm not teaching any, physical, technical skills. Like, I'm not going to, teach how to play guitar or piano,
Right.
but what we're learning theoretically will give you a very good understanding about how to approach a musical instrument. Because, like, for example, when I started learning, um, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around how music works and how you can apply that on an instrument. You usually tend to just learn the physical abilities, like how do I hold a guitar, how do I play a note off of it, where do my fingers go on the keys of the piano. So this is a kind of different, an alternative method to begin learning about music theory. So yes, this should help any and all who want to start, but it's not designed, to so that you're immediately able to jump on an instrument, but it's like more so when you start learning, you'll have a kind of leg up and you won't have to go over certain things that you would have to spend a lot of time on. So hopefully, as a takeaway, you guys will all have an easier time in the future. If you would like to learn an instrument or continue learning an instrument, or if you don't care about that at all, should hopefully have a good takeaway for you. Let's take one more.
I have no plans to play an instrument, but right now I just don't even have like the vocabulary to really talk about music. And my husband tried to teach me some. He plays guitar and has taken music theory, but I think it might be better to try to learn from someone who's not my husband, and then I can talk with him later. So yeah.
Yeah, no, well, that's cool to hear, and I'm glad. It's funny you bring that up. I've as someone who's spent a lot of time doing like professional and semi-professional music teaching, the worst students, not in terms of that they're bad students, it's just the worst people that you have to teach are people that you're close to as a music teacher, because oh god, no, it's a combination of the fact they want to joke all the time and no one wants to listen to what you have to say because they don't take you seriously. So I completely get where you're coming from and where your husband's probably coming from. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to learn something from this course then. Okay, with that out of the way, if if you want to share something after the class is over, if you have something to share in between, go ahead and type it in the chat, and you guys can obviously talk between yourselves in there too. So anyone else wants to tell a little bit about themselves and what interests them relating to music theory, you can go ahead and type that in the chat, and hopefully other people will respond to that. All right. So first off, what we're doing today. This is going to be a workshop in 4 rather unequal parts, but 4 parts nonetheless. We'll be looking at scale theory, chord theory, rhythm theory, and then kind of putting all that together. In all honesty, we're probably going to spend the most amount of time on chord theory and rhythm theory, but it also depends on what you guys want to learn and what your questions are. So this is an outline of what we're doing, but I want to make it really clear that this workshop is meant to be very fluid, because like unlike many of these other craft center workshops, your whole point is you learn an individual skill and then you're able to make a craft by the end of it. With this form of workshop relating to music theory, my end objective is that hopefully you guys will learn something you wanted to learn. And if you don't know what you want to know, that is also totally fine. You can go be along for the ride. But if there's anything specific that you guys want to look into, or if you have more questions about, just please stop me or let me know, or put it in the chat, and Lauren will get around to that. Also, quickly, because I realize we can do this, introduce Lauren. She is the,
Hey.
what's your official title? Do you have an official title for this?
I think we're calling me a moderator.
Yeah, but Lauren is our moderator, okay, and she will be making sure that our Zoom call does not fall into oblivion and set on fire. So again, to reiterate, depending on what works, if a lot of people end up talking over each other, then we'll do it like on a chat-based thing, and Lauren will be the one to moderate and send me questions. But if we're good without that, then we should just be good on open mic. But yes, the last little thing I'll say about the actual workshop today is if you have any questions, like bigger questions or things, I have been given the go-ahead to keep the Zoom call open like at a max of about half an hour. So if you have anything that you want to talk to me, like for example, say you have a question specifically about guitar or anything I do, you can ask me afterwards. Or if you have like an advanced topic you want to ask something quick, like a quick question on, you can definitely stay past 9 p.m. And we can do some of those, get some of those questions out of the way. But yeah, before we move on, does anyone have any questions about what we're doing today or anything else administrative relating to this workshop? Anyone? No? All right. Okay, moving on. So I'll give you a little bit of some knowledge about who I am and what I do. Like I said, I am an undergraduate student here. I am a senior and I plan on graduating in December with a major of psychology BA. And I have been teaching guitar and playing guitar for a rather long time. If you were to ask me exactly how long, I'd probably wager anywhere between 11 and 12 years. And I've been teaching for about four-ish, 4 or 5, maybe even more. I don't honestly keep track. But yeah, so I picked up the instrument when I was only like 11, I think. I've been playing it regularly ever since. There's never been a period in my life that I haven't been actively playing the guitar. So that's that. And I like to consider myself a bit of a music theory aficionado. I like learning, I like teaching music theory specifically because I find it very interesting. That being said, I'm not formally trained. Obviously I'm not pursuing a degree in music. I'm not completely formally trained. So if you have like more advanced questions or something that really enters the realm of what a musicologist would actually research, then I probably won't be good to answer that, but I could point you in the right direction. Additionally, a little bit about my personal background. I grew up here in the States. I moved all around with my family, and I started picked up the guitar and started learning here in like 5th or 6th grade. But the majority of my childhood was spent in India, where I grew up. I spent all of middle school and high school there. That's where I learned guitar. I learned at an actual music academy there, and I graduated the year before I came here to state to pursue my undergraduate degree. And yeah, I learned a lot of cool stuff there, and I did come back after I graduated to student teach a couple times. So I have taught there, and then once I returned here to the States, and I've been here at NC State ever since, I've taught here at the Craft Center and privately for, I want to say, 1.5 years or 2 now. I honestly haven't kept track, but so safe to say I have some credentials when it comes to teaching, so I promise you're in good hands, and I'm not going to mislead you with anything. Little side note on that though is I'm sure all of you know, is this is a very much introductory course to music theory. So I'll point it out when we get there, but there'll be certain concepts where there's very advanced or rather time-consuming explanations for certain concepts. I'll let you know that I won't be explaining that because of time constraints and the fact that it's very confusing. So just know that what I'm teaching you definitely is based in fact, and it is definite real music theory, but there's certain things that I just won't be able to teach adequately in the 2-hour workshop. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Additionally, personally for my music stuff, I play in a band that kind of no longer exists because of quarantine, which is unfortunate, but I've released some music. I personally love rock and metal, but I play basically any kind of genre. I love blues, love jazz, a little bit of indie, but I will basically play anything. But yeah, that's enough about me. Now we can honestly get underway. All right, so we'll start with the slides, and I will probably switch between the cams if there's anything I can show on my guitar, but for the most part, you're going to be seeing slides and not my face. So again, if you feel like you need to ask a question, just type it in chat or shout it out, either or. Okay, so to begin with, some very basic knowledge. This is kind of our building blocks and foundation of music theory as we know it. The first thing you'll notice is that it's highlighted, before we even dive into what any of this means, you'll see Western classical music being repeated. Now, before we even dive into theory itself, it's important to know what Western classical means. Every piece of modern music that you probably hear, even regardless of whether it's Western music or not, is written within the parameters of Western classical notation and theory. So like any kind of pop music, and basically anything Western is obviously going to be based on Western classical ideas, but even many popular and modern genres from non-Western music, like let's take, for example, K-pop or Bollywood music or J-pop music, all of these kind of things are still based in Western classical music. They're not any of these other systems. And I'll briefly talk about what those are a little bit later. But this whole workshop is completely based around Western classical music. It is not based around any of these other systems that exist. So I want to make sure that you guys are aware that there's a distinction. Now, what some of these other systems are can vary deeply based on region, like geographic region, ethnic heritage, culture, all of that. To give you a quick example, this is a little bit more advanced, so I'll explain it in rather simple terms. Turkey and cultural ethnic Turkish music oftentimes does not subscribe to the same limitations and framework that Western classical music does. And I picked Turkey specifically because they have this thing called microtonal music, in which there's actually notes between certain notes. And I know this sounds confusing because I haven't even addressed what a note is. I promise you we'll get there. But basically, there's plenty of other systems that exist that have their own rules, but we're going to focus on Western classical. All right, so to start with, we're going to stay on the left column and then move to the right. The first thing you'll see is there are 7 main notes in Western classical music, and these are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Now, these are what we consider whole tones, and they're kind of the building blocks of what Western classical music is based on, pitch-wise. We'll get into rhythm theory in the second half of the workshop, but these are the 7 main notes, and you'll notice under that there is 12 total notes in Western classical music, and you'll notice that within this notation there's like the hash symbol or the numerical symbol, and then there's a small letter B on the bottom bullet point. So what these represent is sharps and flats. If you see a hash symbol, that means sharp. If you see a little b symbol, that means flat. Now, what does that mean? Those indicate a note between these whole notes. So between, let's look at A and B, for example, there is an A sharp or a B flat. Now, I want to make it very clear right now as is that, so it's not confusing to anyone, A sharp and B flat are the exact same note. I'm not going to switch cams, but I will play it for you guys real quickly. So what you're hearing right now is an A. What you're hearing right now is a B. So I'm going back and forth between A and B. There is one more note between these two, and that is either A sharp or B flat. So if I was to play all 3 in a row, A sharp, B, it would sound like this. So there's a very long-winded explanation as to why we have sharps versus flats, but for the sake of this course, we're going to equate them as the same thing. They're the exact same note, so when we reference them to talk about them, for example, it's up to you how you want to reference it. You can either say, play an A sharp, or play a B flat. It's the same note, and don't worry about any perceived like differences between the two. For all intents and purposes, they're the same note, and you can just pick whichever way you want to go about describing it. So with that in mind, we have these 12 total notes: A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp. Or alternatively, A, B flat, B, C, D flat, D, E flat, E, F, G flat, G, and A flat. So if you guys remember, I said I'd totally down for some amazing audience participation. So I would like, if anyone notices in here that there's a trend, well, something that breaks the trend, within this set of 12 total notes, there are 2 places that there's an inconsistency in this sharp, these this is a semitone, by the way, I should have made that clear, but these notes between the whole tones, there's 2 points in this total set of 12 notes that there's an inconsistency. If anyone notices these 2, or at least one of them, go ahead and point it out. So take a look and go ahead and shout it out if you notice that there's something different going on.
I think you're asking why there isn't a C flat or a B sharp, etc. Same for E and F.
Yes, that is absolutely what I'm looking for. So again, there's a very long-winded explanation for this, but I'm going to give you the short and rather comical one, and it's that there's literally no reason that they had to do this, but this is how it is. And I honestly don't have a better explanation. It's just that when Western classical music was being developed, they decided that they were going to use the system in which no B sharp or C flat existed, and same for E sharp and F. That being said, so how this works is it's not like we're missing a note between them. It's just that instead of there being a note between them, they're immediately back to back. So for example, you know how between A and B, there's an A sharp, and we're going up 1 step. Between B and C, there is no additional step, but it just isn't there. So you would just play B to C. So for example, I'll turn on the noisy amp again. This note, that doesn't like all louder. That's a B. And if I was to play a C, I know it's kind of hard to hear across audio. I'll switch to cam in a little bit so that you guys can have a more visual depiction of what that is. There isn't a note between either 2. It's just back to back. So there isn't a sharp, a B sharp, or a C flat. And same for E and F. This is something that is one of those kind of dumb things that you just kind of have to like memorize. There's no real good logic behind it aside from the fact that Western classical music was developed over 200 to 300 years ago, and a lot of very odd, special and unique circumstances have occurred within just the whole realm of music theory that cause situations like this. So, any questions so far? This is the very basic premise of like pitch theory and melodic theory within Western classical music. So it's very important to understand that these 12 notes exist, and these are the 12 total notes that we can use to create sound in Western classical music. Any questions so far? Okay. Again, if you have anything and I'm in the middle of talking, just type it in chat. Okay, on the right column, on this right side of the screen, we have a little bit just about how these 12 notes work. So these 12 notes exist in their own sphere. That being said, there's obviously more than 12 notes you can make on an instrument at all. So for example, I'll try this. You know what, I'll save it for when I switch to cam, but there's a lot of variations of these 12 total notes. So I can have a middle C, a low C, a high C, a very high C, a very low C. What that means is that it's the same note, just played at different frequencies. If you actually want to know the direct physics behind this, it'd be the doubling or halving of the hertz or the actual frequency. So for example, if middle C is 60 hertz, then high C would be 120 hertz. It's the same note, it's just double the frequency. I promise you, as soon as I switch to cam, and I'll show you on my guitar. It'll make a lot more sense having a visual representation of this. So what this concept is of different notes and different ranges is octaves. So when you loop through these 12 total notes and get to a higher register or lower register version of these notes, you get an octave. So for example, if we looked at these 12 total notes and I played all the way from A sharp, B, C, keep going all the way to G sharp, and then I came back after G sharp to A, I would have played one whole octave. I would have reached one octave between that first A and the second A. One other small thing, so to clarify, the 7 main notes are whole tones, and the sharps and flats are semitones. There's another naming mechanism that we use to clarify how we talk about stepping between notes. If I was to go from A to A sharp, for example, that is called a half step. Okay, I'm only going half a step. If I go from A to B, that's a whole step. I'm kind of skipping one in the middle. Now, where this can get a bit confusing is, like, let's take, for example, like we said, B to C. If I go B to C, you might think that's a whole step because I'm going between whole tones, but that's not how that works. Since I'm only going one space to the next note, that's only a half step. So, for example, between A to B, that's a whole step, but between B to C, that's a half step. If I wanted to go a whole step above B, I would go to C sharp. Does this make sense? Any questions about this so far? Okay. Now, if you give me 1 second. All right. Hope you guys can see me again.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. So to demonstrate what I just talked about, on a guitar, it's actually kind of simple. It's laid out so that it's very easy to see how you achieved an octave of these 12 notes. How you know that, for those of you who own a guitar, is you will see 2 dots right here, and that represents 12 notes. So that means you've gone through a whole octave. Various other music instruments have similar functions, but it's quite simple on a guitar. But again, this isn't a concept that just applies to guitar, it's just rather easy for me to show. So if I was to follow these 12 total notes, this is the A string, the second string right here. If I was to go through all of these, it would be A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, G sharp, and then we're back to A. If you'll notice, this is one version of A, this is another version of A. While they have different pitches, they are the same note. So at the end of the day, these naming mechanisms can be a little bit confusing to pick up, but once you have it mastered, it's a decently intuitive system. 1 second. Now moving on, we will talk about how you use these notes. There is a very important way in that these notes are actually used. While all, as you guys probably just heard, if you play all of the notes that you have available in a row, they're not going to sound particularly good. They're just going to sound almost comical, right? If I do that again. Right? It doesn't sound particularly musical or melodic. The reason for this is that, like mentioned earlier, these are all of the notes we have available to us. That doesn't mean that they're all going to sound good together. What the concept of building a structure that out of notes that makes them sound good together is what we call scales. And that's what I have here. Now, scale theory is probably the most important thing that we will learn from this workshop. It is really, quite honestly, the basis of everything music melodic related. Aside from rhythm, it's the most important thing. Now, how do we do this? Now, this is where I want you guys with your, pencil, paper, pen, whatever you have on you to get ready. We'll do some exercises in a little bit, but how we build a scale is we essentially have a formula. This formula is static. It never changes. It's the same and can be applied to anything. But you use this formula, one of these two, either major or minor. I'll explain what these mean. But you apply a formula to the 12 total notes you have, and with that, you will get one of these melodic scales. Now, I won't dive into it too in depth, but generally speaking, it's the common knowledge that a major scale or chord or note or like concept is going to be happy, and a minor scale or chord or something is going to sound sad. And we're not going to dive too much into what that means specifically, just because it's a very, very advanced and honestly time-consuming concept. So just for your guys' knowledge at the given moment, just know that major scale is the happy one and the minor scale is the sad one. I'll play you an example of both. If I was to play the C major scale that's noted there, it would sound like this. Right? And if I was to play the A minor scale, it would sound something like this. So it's important to know the difference, but we'll get more into specifics regarding types of scales later. But to start with, how do I apply these formulas? You have them both on the screen. These formulas never change. For the major scale, it will always be this formula. For the minor scale, it will always be this formula. We'll talk about other scales in a little bit, but we'll worry about this right now. As you guys remember, I explained what a whole step and a half step meant. So a whole step would basically be skipping, if you start on A, you're going two notes ahead. So from A, you'd be going A sharp and then to B, because that's a whole step. It's two little jumps. And if you're doing a half step, you're only doing one jump. Now, if you see the example at the bottom here, I think it'll be easiest for you guys if you kind of trace on the list, the little section above that, it has A sharp, B, C. If you look at that and trace how this is applied, you will be able to better understand how to get these scales. So, for example, let's take C major, the one I just played. It's one of the easiest scales to remember. Let's apply the major scale formula to this whole list of the 12 total notes we have. How do I know where to begin? If I want to find the scale for a particular note, that note is called the root note, the root. It is the one that you start from. And in this case, we want to find C major, so obviously we'll start on C. Now, I'm starting on C. I haven't moved anywhere yet. The first thing the formula says for me to do is take one whole step. From there, from C, we go to D. That's one whole step. Another whole step will take us to E. And then next in the formula is a half step. We go to F. Then we go another whole step to G, another whole step to A, and then another whole step to B. And then if you want to return to the octave, you would take a half step and come back to C. Now, if you've noticed, for C major, this is extremely easy and simple because it basically excludes all of those semitones. We don't have any sharps or flats. We just have the whole tones. That's why C major is the easiest scale to remember. It's just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back to C. Conversely, we'll get into A minor in a second, and I'll explain how the same notes make a different scale. We'll talk about that. But this concept can be a little bit tricky to understand at first, but once you understand how to make sense of applying whole and half steps, you can end up with a pretty easy working knowledge. Now, professional musicians are able to do this on the fly in the middle of playing a song when they're improvising, for example, but it takes years and years to get there. For most musicians, you like say you knew you wanted to write a song in C major, you would sit down ahead of time and use these formulas and figure out what notes you could play. So while we're here, our first little exercise is I want you guys to use this major scale formula, the one on the top right, and apply it to the 12 total notes we have for the scale of G major. And that means obviously it would start on G. I am going to sit here and give you guys, I'll say 1 or 2 minutes. And when you're done, you can go ahead and type it in the chat. All right, so go ahead, go for it now. I would highly recommend writing it down instead of trying to memorize all of it, but just try and have a go at it. How are we doing, Lauren? I don't
No,
think I've found the chat button.
yeah, no one in the chat yet.
Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to use your mic and ask. There's no, no shame in not knowing what the heck is happening.
So just to be clear, from your examples,
Mhm.
when you do those steps, it only goes in one direction. Like you wouldn't go backwards in terms of, so to
Yes,
speak.
I'm very glad you bring this up. Let me pull this back up. Yeah, so when we talk about building a scale and using a formula, we mean to go from left to right. I should have explained that. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. But yes, we go from left to right. But generally speaking, how this terminology is used, just like say a musician, you're talking with them and you're on the note C, they say go a whole step up, then they obviously mean higher in pitch, which means to go to D. And if you say go down by a half step, you go to B. But for the sake of building scales, you always go left to right or up in pitch. You never go down or back. But yeah, good question.
We've got a couple of responses in the chat, which I think they're all the same. G, A, B, C, D, F, or F sharp, G.
All right. Give me 1 second. All right. Yeah, no, I see this. All right. So if you haven't finished yet, that's fine. You don't have to type it in chat. But from everything, yeah, that is, Lauren, what you just read and what everyone's putting, that is absolutely correct. So I'm glad that all of you are following. Anyone not get that answer or, is having some kind of an issue with this, please go ahead. Again, there's no shame at all. This is a completely intro course. If you don't get it, please make sure you let me know. Okay, so yeah, this is totally correct. Again, I see some people in the chat put the last, G and some didn't. That's totally up to you. It really doesn't matter. It's implied that when you put the scale, that obviously the next note after the F sharp, for example, is going to be back at the octave of G. So either or is totally fine. But yeah, that's completely correct. Now that you guys have a hang of this, moving to minor scales should be quite easy, actually. As you can see, it's just the same concept. You're just using a different formula. So for this one, I'm not going to over-explain it. You have the A minor example in front of you. We'll talk about a little bit more about this as soon as we do this exercise. But let me see. What do I want to give you? Why don't you guys do D minor? So our root note is D, and I'd like you guys, again, same concept, use the minor scale formula, the bottom one, and apply it. Do it on paper, whatever you have on you, and type it in the chat when you're done. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. That's not what I want to do. All right, how are we doing?
Nothing in the chat yet. First one is D, E, F, G, A sharp, C, D.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything until at least a couple more people get going.
Yeah, a couple more people responding, they're getting the same thing.
Okay, great. Again, same, if you haven't got it already, that's totally fine. But yes, that is correct. So D minor is also a similarly simple enough one to get with, same as G major. There's only one note difference between G major and C major, and there's only one note difference between D minor and A minor, but so it's relatively easy. But yeah, no, so that's completely correct. I don't really have more to add to that, except for the fact that this is basically how we build scales. That being said, there is a lot more other types of scales. Major and minor scales are two of a very vast amount of scales. These just happen to be the most common ones that you will see in everyday music. If you're curious as to what they sounded like, G major would sound like this. And D minor would sound like this. So yeah, any questions here before we move on? All right. So like I keep saying, there are lots of different types of scales and formulas. These are very basic ones that you'll see in everyday music. However, there's a lot of other cool ones that you could look at. If you have questions or if you want to know more about this, I'd say stick a little bit after 9 so that I can like give you some more specific examples. But off the top of my head, I'll give you a couple that you may or may not have heard before. Make sure this is all right. A different variation or version of a minor scale would be a harmonic minor. A lot of people associate this with, or call it the Egyptian scale or the Middle Eastern scale, because it sounds like very typical of that kind of music. So that would sound something like this. That would be D harmonic minor. You have plenty of other scales that you could look at as well. There's a blues scale that, as the name implies, is used almost entirely just in blues. The E minor blues would sound like this. And of course, there's more and more, and you could really get down the rabbit hole of these things. Like I said, within Western classical music, you know, we have certain limitations, but even then, there are still plenty of other ethnic or cultural scales that exist elsewhere in the world that still can be used within the framework of Western classical music. I mean, the harmonic minor would be a good example of that, but there's another example, a small one I could give you would be one of these, an actual Indian classical scale. It sounds a little bit like this. Something like that. But there's a lot of different combinations, formulas, and things you can get going from there. Any questions so far? All right, moving on. So now that we've had our basis for melodic, you know, like scale theory, you might ask, first of all, what is a chord? And then after that, second of all, how do I make one? So a chord is what happens when you play. The very basic way of explaining this is just a chord is what happens when you play multiple notes at the exact same time. most instruments can't do this. Like if you're talking about orchestral or big band instruments, you can only play one note at a time. But certain instruments like the guitar, piano, ukulele, things like that, you can play multiple notes at a time and you will get a chord. I'm not going to turn on the amp for this, but this is an example of a G major chord. If I played just a bunch of chords together, they would sound something like this. So this is probably what you guys are most familiar with or typical, like think of typically when it comes to like piano or guitar music is you, unless you're listening to like blues or rock or something like that, you won't be hearing just individual notes from a piano or a guitar. You'd probably just be hearing chords. Chord theory, the basis of it is actually quite simple, but it can get very complex very quickly. As you may or may not be reading on the slide, the basis is actually very easy to figure out. Once you get your major, minor, whatever scale you have, but in this case, to keep it simple, we'll just look at the major, minor scales. You take those and you use a similar formula to determine what notes you should use to get a chord from that scale. This formula just happens to be extremely simple and easy to get. So yeah, if we follow step by step, take your major and minor scale. Let's stay with C major for right now. You have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and obviously back to C if you wanted it, but for this case in point, we'll just stick to this. All you have to do, quite literally, all you have to do is just take the first, the third, and the fifth note of the scale, and you get the chord. So for C major, that would be C, E, and G. What does that sound like? It would sound like this. As you may or may not be able to hear, there's more than just 3 strings or notes being played. The reason for that is, like we talked before about octaves, is that certain notes are actually being played twice at different frequencies. There's no more than those 3 notes there. So if I was to play it, just the 3, it would just sound like this. If I wanted to stack them with more octaves of those notes, I could get a full chord with 5 different notes in it. Of course, they're all only variations of C, E, or G. It's the exact same concept for a minor chord or minor scale. You just, for example, would take A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you'll get A, C, E, and it would sound like this. This concept applies universally. This formula never changes. As long as you're using a major and minor scale, if you apply this formula, you will get the respective major or minor chord from that. So it's very important to make this clear that if I'm using C major, I'm not going to get the G major chord from C major. If I apply this formula, that's not how that works. You will get the same chord as the root note of the scale, which is C. Now, last thing, because I forgot to touch upon this one in scales. Like I said, there is, if you notice, between C major and A minor, actually I can go back. If you notice between C major and A minor, they have the exact same notes. They're just played in a different order. Does anyone want to shout out and just take a guess for what this possibly means, or any implications, any little guesses or things that they have relating to this? Someone could just go for it. What do you think this means?
I think it means they would sound good together.
Yes, absolutely correct. So that's exactly what that means. We have a term for this, that they are relative major and minor. So C major's relative minor is A minor, and A minor's relative major is C major. They're the exact same notes, just played from a slightly different starting point, right? So again, let me turn on the amp for this. If I was, actually, make this a little bit easier.
I do have a question in the chat when you're ready.
Sure, we can take that first.
Okay. Are there scales that don't fit into the Western classical notes?
Yes. Okay. How about, yeah, I'll address that once I've explained this. That is a good question. It actually has to do with a little bit about the Turkish music I was talking about before, microtones. We'll talk about that in a second. But before we get there, yeah, let me explain what these relative major and minors are. So now that you can see me again, I'll again play for you C major and A minor. Again, the volume decided to die. So that's C major, and then A minor is just. While they are two distinctly different sounding scales, they are the same notes, so you could play them absolutely together. So this is where, we'll talk about this in a bit, but if you were to look at a more advanced concept, if I had a bunch of chords in the key, we'll talk about what keys are, but if you have a bunch of chords in the key of C major, I would be able to play either the C major or A minor scale over that. So for example, if I kept playing, so just as an example, you could pick, even though I was playing chords in the key of C major, A minor sounds good over that. Let me switch it back. So actually, I'll leave it on this. As a concept, this relative major and minor thing is important to know, but actually I will switch it back because this is a question for everyone as soon as I get the screen going. So it's a relative major and minor, and like I said, you can play it from, it's just the only difference between them is you're playing it from a different note. But as you'll notice, also, can you guys see my pointer, like my mouse?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So I can actually use that as a little bit of a pointer. All right, so as you can see, if you're playing C major, you're playing from C. If I'm playing, and if I'm using A minor as a relative minor, I'm playing from A. But if you find like the note A within C major, you can use that to, build A minor off of that. So instead of, using the minor scale formula, what you could also do is already just have C major and then take A and just say, oh, all I have to do is do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then I'm back to A, and that would be A minor. Now, this is a little bit more of an advanced concept, but I like teaching it in this kind of a workshop thing because I think it's rather important as a concept to understand. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what would happen if I was to play the same set of notes, but from a different, like a starting point that wasn't C or A? What happens if I try to play it from D or from E or to F or G or B? Anyone want to take a guess? Someone can just have a go at it. There's no such thing as a wrong answer when you're learning. Anybody? Going once? Going twice? All right. So what this would mean is that you could build different scales, and playing it from a different position just means that you're going to get a different kind of scale. Now this is where it can get really confusing, and I won't go too far in depth with this, but let's just put it this way. The major and minor scales are only two different forms of scales that you could possibly play. If you realize, if you look here, if we're excluding the octave, the second C that would come here, there's 7 different notes that you could play. And that means that's 7 different starting points. C and A are just 2 of them. So if I was to start from D, E, F, G, or B, I would get different kinds of scales, even if I'm playing the same exact notes, just from a different starting point. This is what we call modes, M-O-D-E-S, just modes. The major and minor scales are 2 different modes. However, there are 6 other that are available to you, right? Sorry, 5, if I put it that way. Yeah, there's 5 other that are available to you. And all of these sound slightly different. I won't go too far in depth on this, but just know that the major and minor scale are only 2 of these 7, and they're the 2 most commonly used in modern and popular music. But there are other ones that are used, and I can give you guys a quick example of how this might sound. All right. So, like you've heard me do it a couple times already. I'll do it one more time. This is C major. This is A minor. Now, if I played one of these modes or different scales in between them, I could get something like. I could get. That would just be a small example. All of these in between modes have different names, but they're all in Italian. Like if you wanted me to name a couple, there'd be Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Locrian. I'm not even going to bother getting into those, but I just wanted to highlight that there are other scales that you could derive from this very, basic way of looking at music. Like there are more than just major and minors. But for the sake of
I
this,
have a question.
oh yeah, go ahead.
I've heard of the pentatonic scale. Does that relate to what you're talking about, or is that different still?
I'm glad you bring that up. That is slightly different. That's actually a kind of nested scale. It's derived on, like we have these 12 notes here, we derive the minor scale. On top of that, once you get a minor scale, you use a formula to get the pentatonic minor from a minor scale. So it's a similar form of thinking, but it's not exactly what I'm talking about. But I'm glad you asked that question. We're gonna touch upon that in a bit. But yeah, so for the sake of this, if I was just to play, the same notes from a different position, I'd get different scales. For the sake of this workshop, I just want you guys to have the takeaway that these relative major and minors exist, and they're the same notes, and they can go perfectly well together over some music, like some chords, and it's just 2 different ways of approaching it. If you want to remember this, just know that the relative major and minor, the relative minor from a major is always the 6th note, and the relative the relative major from the minor is always the 3rd note, and that never changes.
I have another question in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Brazilian chorizo music, is there a specific scale that is most used with that?
So I'm no expert on world music, so I'm not going to talk about that kind of stuff. But yes, for every kind of not necessarily every kind of genre, but most kinds of genres either have a particular scale they use or a particular way of using scales. So for example, lots of music will use the same scales, but they'll just use it differently, and that's a rather advanced thing to look at. If you want to discuss that a little bit more, whoever asked that, feel free to stay behind after 9. But for the sake of right now, we'll kind of pass that over. But if you want to go into specifics about, I know a little bit about Brazilian music. They like using what we call augmented scales, augmented minors, augmented majors. They like using 7th scales, and they like using what we call chromatics. There's a lot of jargon, lots of words, so you don't have to remember any of those. But there are, to answer your question, there are a lot of like associated very specific scales. But I'm no expert in this, so I couldn't answer that completely, honestly. Going back to that first original question in the chat about in between, scales that don't exist between that don't exist within the bounds of Western classical music. Yes, absolutely. And the first thing I brought up was Turkish music. Those use what we call microtones. We've talked about it several times, but this is the 12 total notes we have in Western classical music. What a microtone and what like a traditional Turkish scale be, instead of having 12 tones, they'd have something like 24. They'd have double the amount because they'd have even more like minuscule notes between these. And it would, to someone who's used to hearing Western music, it would sound absolutely abhorrent. It would sound extremely out there. It wouldn't sound like music to you. It would sound more like a bunch of noise because you're not used to hearing these kind of notes in between. It would sound very much, the best analogy I could give for you is it would sound to you, someone who's used to hearing Western classical music, it would sound like the instrument is completely out of tune. It's very difficult to give an example on a guitar because, again, this is not supposed to be specific, this workshop to guitar, but it's the same problem with piano is every single fret on a guitar or every single key on a piano is tied to one specific note from these 12 from Western classical, so it's actually kind of difficult. It's actually impossible on a piano to go out of the 12 total notes. On a guitar, you can use a technique called bending to actually bend the string a little bit out of pitch. So if you want an example of what a microtone will sound like, if I have, doing the thing again. If I have B, this is the note B, and then if I have the note C, if I wanted to try and go between that and I bend the string a little bit, it would sound like. See, it sounds almost like I'm playing out of tune and it doesn't sound right. That would be an example of non-traditional, like Western classical way of thinking about notes. To whoever put that in chat, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, feel free, again, I'm gonna keep saying this, feel free to stay back after 9 and we can discuss that a little bit more. Last thing to address one more time, the pentatonic thing, I'll just give an example of that. Like I said, we had A minor. I'll take A minor because it's simple. You would use another formula within that to remove more notes, at which point you would get a pentatonic. The reason it's called a pentatonic is it's just 5, penta, 5. It's a scale that's made of just 5 notes. It just sounds like this. So that would be a pentatonic scale. Anyway, moving on, back to chord theory. Like I said, this is very simple as a concept to grasp. I'll have a little activity right now. I think we're falling behind pace a little bit, so we'll keep this a little bit quick. I'll just give you one of each and you can do it both at the same time. So I hope you guys still have on hand the G major and the D minor that you guys wrote out earlier. Using those, just get the G major chord and D minor chord. You can take a couple minutes and just put it in chat. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to go ahead and shout it out.
All right, got a couple of responses. Everyone on the major, or for G major, they said G, B, D. And then for D minor, they said D, F, A.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I was taking a drink. What was that again? G, B, D, and what was the other one?
D, F, A.
All right, yeah. So that is completely correct too. So I'm glad you guys are getting the concept. It's for building chords, it's actually, or like just regular major and minor chords, it's very simple. There's not much to it. Now, where chords become difficult is when you're trying to apply them, like how do I use them? Now, bear with me when we take a look at this huge chart that may not make any sense. I promise you will make sense of it. Just know that this is the best I could find on Google Images. I'm sorry that I couldn't find something that wasn't as, overwhelming. Your first task is to bear with me. I can use my pointer and find this line, this row. This is just C major. Again, we're sticking with C major. We'll take some other examples, but we're just sticking with C major because it's so easy to remember since it's just C, D, E, F, G, A, B. All right, so there's a lot on your screen right now. You might be wondering, what am I looking at? Now that you've got chords, you probably want to be able to use them. If you were to play a song that was all just one chord, it's going to sound very boring. So for example, if I just had, C major as a chord and I kept playing it for a whole 3 minutes, that's not going to sound particularly interesting. It's just going to be this. And then over and over again, it's very boring. It doesn't go anywhere. then you're wondering, how do I know what the other chords or other, how can I use this and make a song? How can I actually make music? You would use what we call chord degrees. I know it's not written here. They call it major chord progressions. That's another way of calling it. But the usual term that we have for this is chord degrees, as in like degrees Fahrenheit, same degrees. How we determine this is each of these notes from the scale. Again, this is just C, D, E, F, G, A, B. This is C major. Each of these notes gets a degree or a position determined to that. And that position never changes depending, it doesn't matter what major scale you use. These are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G major, all of these back to back. It doesn't matter, what scale you use, these positions don't change for any note. So the first note, the root note of C major is always going to be C major, the C major chord. However, if I, wanted to keep going and I wanted to know all of the possible chords I could play in the key, that is the scale or the key of C major, I would use this chart and I would find out what these chords would be. So an example of how to read this is, we'll talk about the Roman numerals in a little bit, but first just look at the major and minors. We're also going to talk about what this chord is later. But to begin with, we have C major, self-explanatory. Then the second degree or second position, and all that means is it's the second note in the scale. If we're going from left to right, from low pitch to high pitch, is D. I would look at this and see, oh, I have to play D minor, not D major. And then going another one over to play E minor. Keep going. The fourth position, F major. Then fifth position, G major. And then remember, this is the relative minor, so it's actually kind of self-explanatory that you would play the relative minor chord if you're doing that. But as always, in the sixth position, you would play A minor. Then when you get to the seventh, we have a completely different kind of chord called a diminished chord. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but for right now, we'll look at these first six positions. For starters, I hope that this is making sense. This chart isn't the most intuitive, but once you understand what it means, it's not the most difficult thing. If you have any questions, feel free to shout them out. Just say something, and I'll further explain.
So what is exactly like you're following? Just okay. So this is a chord. Can you just try to do it another way? Explain this chart, I guess, this progression from major to diminished. Okay, we saw chords is when you play notes at the same time. You have the scale formula, and you have the notes that go from the two different Western. Just I didn't catch this.
That's totally fine. I know, like, this is one of the concepts that can take a little bit of time, and it's actually helpful to hear what this sounds like. So let me go ahead and play it, and then I'll explain it as I'm going along. All right, so to start with, we had that C major scale, which was the first thing we found, right? It was just C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Once we got that, we found the major chord out of that. We found C major. The thing is, I do understand where the confusion can be is that, say if you wanted to actually find out how to play, for example, D minor as a chord, you would need to go through the whole process for the D minor scale to actually find that chord. So you would use the formula. You would use the formula here to find using the minor scale formula for D to get D minor, like we did earlier from G, for example, G and D, G major and D minor. And then you would use this to get the first, third, and fifth note. And then from there, we would know this is the second chord that I'm going to play in this progression. Okay, now to bring this like all together, what this would mean is, so we have the scale, right? This is the key. This is the whole idea that we're playing around is C major, which is this scale. Right? So if I want to apply that scale using chords, you obviously can start with the C major chord. The same key, the key of C major. If I wanted to keep playing more chords but not leave that scale or not leave the key, then I would have to learn what are the other chords that are in this scale, or in this key, however you want to use those words interchangeably. So I would look at this chart and I'd see, okay, so I have C major, then I have D minor, then I have E minor, F major, then G major, then A minor, and then B diminished. And it's not a particularly good sounding chord, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But if I was to play all of these in a row, they would, it would sound good. You can also put them in different orders. The only thing this concept is getting at is that the idea is that for a single scale or key, there's certain chords that sound good in that key and others that won't sound good. So for example, if I'm just playing C, let's take the first, fourth, and fifth chords of this progression of this chord degrees. That would just be for, in this case, C major, F major, and G major. Right? That sounds pretty good. It sounds like it could be a song. If I played something that was out of key, it would probably sound pretty bad. Like, for example, that's a very jarring effect because I'm playing the wrong chord. Instead of playing F sharp, instead of playing F major, I played F sharp major. And that's clearly not in the key. It doesn't sound good. So that's all that this chart and this concept are getting at, is that you have different degrees that explain what chords you can use in the key. Did that give you a better understanding? Okay, good. And I know, again, this chart isn't the most helpful, but how you apply this is you can use this for if you take the root, it's the first one, that first position, you take the root, and that's how you know what key or scale you're using. Okay, the Roman numerals, I would tell you not to pay too much attention to that. That's more if you're trying to become an accomplished musician. Just the capital Roman numerals are for majors, major chords. The small lowercase Roman numerals are for minor chords. And then if it has that actual degree symbol next to it, it's a diminished. Okay, I'll quickly talk about what a diminished chord is. I know it sounds kind of jarring. It's not a particularly happy chord, but the reason it's there is that it fits the scale. If you were to use it in actual accompaniment with the music, it doesn't sound nearly as bad. Obviously, you'd also probably be playing it slightly differently, but if I was to give you an example for C. I know it can still be a little bit jarring, but it's still within the bounds of the scale. All right, any questions about this before we move on? Okay.
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for the diminished, what are you doing differently with your hands, if that makes sense?
Okay, yeah, let me switch some cameras around. All right, so, I mean, it's different on every instrument, but if I was to give you an example, what a diminished chord actually is, and the reason it's different from many others is it's actually only, it's called a tritone in that there's equal space between notes. This is a rather advanced concept, but basically it's a very particular oddball kind of chord. So if I was to play again, let's take, give me 1 second. If I was to play all of the chord degrees in C major, it would again sound like this. You notice that B it's just kind of stacking a bunch of very dissonant sounding notes on top of each other, and it creates a very unique effect. But that being said, it's part of how we view chord degrees. Does me demonstrating that kind of answer what you were going for?
Yeah, I think I got it.
Okay. was the wrong one. My bad. Okay. Now, moving forward, this is a different way of visualizing the same thing. Again, I know it looks kind of all over the place, but all you need to kind of look at is you don't have to know anything about anything here. I thought I'd just give you this as a different visualization of that same thing. This just shows A minor or C major in terms of chords. So, for example, if I was to look at this similarly, I would just see C major, D minor. If you also want to look at the Roman numerals, we'd start here. I don't know why they didn't start it earlier, but we start here for 1, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and then back to C. I just put this in here because, like I said, I'm going to be sending out these slides, and this is just out of different views. We won't look at this too much. Another little additive to this is what we're talking about is, I mean, so far we've only seen major and minor chords and then that little diminished guy in there. But there's also a ton of different variations of other types of chords. There's similar to scales, there's an infinite amount of different crazy chords that you can play with different sounds. So I'll give you a couple here, and feel free to pause me and ask me if you want to know more about that. Or again, stay behind after 9 and we can take a look at some other stuff. But so like I said, I mean, we have this is just a major chord. This would just be a minor chord. And they sound very basic in their respects, but there's other kinds of chords. You can play a 7th chord. These are the ones that sound very bluesy. Then you can play different variations. If you actually combine 7th chords with major and minor chords, you get what we call major 7ths and minor 7ths. Things like that. So there's a lot of these variations. There's also the concept of neutral chords in that they don't sound happy or sad and they can be used in different contexts. These would be called suspended chords or add 9 chords. They have a lot of different names that can go by, but an example of this would be, or notice how they on their own don't sound happy or sad. I could make them sound that way, like either way, by adding the respective note to it. So I could do, or I could do, but then the base of it would just be. Any questions about anything that we've talked about so far? I know a lot of it can be very confusing in a short workshop environment. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to go back and re-explain some of these concepts. Okay. So we're going to take a real quick break. The reason it's going to be really quick is that we're actually a little bit behind. So give yourself, like, let's reconvene at 8:30. That gives you about 4 minutes. You just grab some water, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. We'll come back at 8:30 and keep going at it. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them right now too. All right, we can reconvene in about a second here. I'll give people a little bit of time to get going. All right, hopefully everyone is back by now. We can go back to what we were doing. Okay, so hopefully with everything we've covered so far, things have made sense, and it's been kind of, logical in that how this stuff kind of works. We're going to switch gears a little bit and head over to rhythm theory, which is obviously, when we talk about music theory, we're generally speaking about both. Just in general, we're talking about the idea of what goes into making music. But if you were to look at it from a studying perspective, rhythm theory and melodic or harmonic theory are very different things in the way that you would approach them. They're kind of meant to be used in conjunction, but on their own, they're adequately interesting fields of study. Now, we'll be doing a couple of exercises, but I'm going to see how this works. I haven't done this over an online class before, but we'll see how this goes. Okay, so to begin with, rhythm is basically just the way in which you perceive time as a musician. There's obviously a lot that goes into that, and it's a very catch-all way of saying it. But in essence, it's just how do we divide time, how do we interpret time, and how do we fit notes in time. That's probably the most important part, is how we space notes, how long a note goes for, the space between notes, things like that. That's everything that's accomplished in rhythm theory. Now, I have a lot of stuff on the screen right here. Rhythm theory is a little bit, honestly, of the opposite of scale theory and chord theory that we went through, in that it can actually be quite easy to pick up, but getting more advanced with it can be very confusing very quickly. So please let me know if you have any issues with the stuff we're looking at, because like I said, it can really get very hard to understand very quickly. Okay, so to begin with, for the sake, obviously earlier, for the sake of the workshop, we didn't really look at notation for melodic, theory as much, like scale theory and chord theory, mainly because that would be a lot of effort to teach, and it takes a lot of time to get used to. The reason I'm doing it here is it's kind of necessary to be able to even approach understanding what rhythm theory is. So we're going to start by looking at the left picture for a second, left image. To start with, it's very simple to understand in the beginning. This little O symbol, this little shape, that represents what we call a whole note. Now, please remember, and don't get this confused with whole tones or whole steps or stuff that we talked about in scale theory and melodic theory. This is a completely different kind of concept entirely. So when we say whole note, we mean this thing. I want you guys to ignore this part, the right two columns of this graph, of this picture right now. We're just looking at the symbol and the name, just so you can understand. We'll come back to this in a little bit. But yeah, this would be a whole note. This open circle with the stem is a half note. The closed circle, the filled in circle with the stem, is a quarter note. Taking the quarter note and adding this little tail to it gives you an eighth note. And if you add two tails, you get a 16th note. And then there are obviously more than this. You can keep going. To get a 32nd note, you would add three tails. To get a 64th note, you would add four tails, and so on and so forth. Now, we'll talk about what this means and how to apply it, but before we get there, first, let's look at this. This is our time signature. This is a very important word. It's here as well, but this is the way we're going to learn how to interpret what this stuff means. You don't have to worry about this symbol. This just denotes treble clef. We're not going to worry about that at all. We're just looking at these numbers. What do these numbers mean? We see one number on top of another. In this case, it's 4/4. The easiest way to think of this is, like I said earlier, how we plan on dividing time for a certain song. Now, the way time is divided is into chunks or blocks called measures or bars. You can use them interchangeably, either a bar or a measure. For the sake of right now, bars are easier because they're easier to say, but one bar or one measure, in the case of this, which is called 4/4, just a 4 on top of a 4, we call this a measure of 4/4. That means that we have 4 quarter notes per measure. Now, this can get very confusing very quickly, but all you have to know is that, I think if you want to write this down, if you want to remember this in the future, it'll make it easy. The top number dictates how many, the bottom number dictates of what. This is probably the easiest way I could describe and explain this concept. Top number, how many, bottom number, of what. So if we were to use this, remember, all these things line up to something here. We're talking about 4/4, which means 4 notes of quarter notes. A 4 represents, in this case, a quarter note. This is something you'll have to learn. It's not exactly self-intuitive. 4 represent quarter notes. That means we have 4 quarter notes per measure. Now, it's at this point you have to understand what the value of each of these mean. The way we look at values of time is through the idea of beats. I'm sure you guys have heard the idea of beats per minute before, or the idea of just beats in general. Now, this is the part. Again, you feel free to write down any of this stuff that you want to. Again, you'll get the slides, but if it makes it easier, anything that I'm saying you might want to write down, because this can get a little bit confusing because it's not exactly, logical in the whole way. A whole.
Can you, sorry, can you just say again, it's 4 quarter notes on, can you repeat that part, what it is exactly that we're looking at?
Yes, so we're talking about this. This would be 4 quarter notes per measure. That's all this symbolizes. So 4 quarter notes per chunk of time. And in this case, this would just be 4 of these. Now I'll explain what these mean. To begin with, a whole note has a value of 4 beats, exactly 4. This never changes. A whole note is always worth 4 beats. As you can imagine, half of that is worth 2 beats. A quarter note is worth a single beat. An eighth note is worth half a beat. A 16th note is worth a quarter of a beat. So far, does this all make sense about the values? I hope this is all rather understandable. Any questions about what I just said, specifically relating to this? We'll get to the time signature and what this means in a second, but everything that I've just said, has anyone have any questions about that? Okay. So again, 4 beats, 2 beats, 1 beat, half a beat, a quarter of a beat. So if we are to look at this, which is our time signature, this is what dictates. This always comes before the song, and it shows you how you're supposed to interpret time for that passage of music. This means, like I said, this is the top number indicates the amount, the bottom number indicates of what. This means that we have 4 of quarter notes. And as we remember, quarter notes have the value of 1 beat. So if we are to logically apply this, this means that if we're going to have 4 quarter notes, 4 beats, then we'll have 4 beats in a measure. That's not what I wanted to do. Okay. So is this making sense so far? If you see a 4/4, if there's a measure of 4/4, that means that we have 4 beats in the measure because we have 4 quarter notes. Does this not make sense to anyone? Okay. That being said, this is not the only way that you can, write time signatures. As you can probably see down here, there's a lot of different ways of describing time or time signatures. Probably the best way, again, is if you were to memorize the idea that the top number is how many, bottom number of what. If we're to look at some of these examples, some of these are actually really not practical. Like you really wouldn't be using 3/16 in real music, but it's a good way of teaching. But we can start with 3/2. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what this means? If this is 4 quarter notes, 4 beats per measure, what would this mean?
3 half notes.
Yes, that is exactly correct. So what this means is, do you want to do the math and tell us how many beats per measure this would be? Anybody? So it would be 3 half notes. How many beats would that be? If each half note is worth 2 beats, how many beats do we have in this measure?
1.5.
No, so you're not dividing it.
Oh,
6.
Yes. So this time signature, this measure would be worth 6 beats. So if you want something more practical in terms of understanding, 4/4 is 4 beats. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Every time I clap my hands would be one of these half notes. And the total would come up to 6 beats. Moving on. Does everyone understand this so far?
Just sorry. How do you know it's a half note and not a whole note on that example that you're showing that?
That's a great question. Like I said, it's a little bit unintuitive, but the bottom number always refers to one of these. So for example, 4 means quarter, 2 means half. If we were to look at some of these quickly, 8 would mean 8th note, 16 would be 16th note. So you kind of just pair the bottom number to the value. So if you saw a 1 on the bottom, that would be a whole note. I know it's a little bit unintuitive, like it could make, like, because these are kind of misnomers, right? You would expect a whole note that's worth 4 beats to be like a 4 note or something like that. So it can be a little bit confusing, but this is how this is all explained and notated. But yeah, it's a good question. So yeah, this would be 3 half notes, which is worth 6 beats, and it would be counted as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now for this one, 3/4. First, someone tell me what this means. What does 3 before we even get to how many beats are in this measure? What is this? Anybody? Remember what I said. The top number is bottom number of what?
3 quarter notes.
Yes, that is completely correct. Yeah. Now, good job on the first part. Now that you've said that, how many beats are in this measure if there's 3 quarter notes?
maybe 3.
Yep, it would be just 3 beats per measure. It would sound like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, is that a waltz?
Yeah, this is considered a waltz. 3/4. There's a couple of different variations of this, and we'll get into this in the more advanced. I think I have a slide for that somewhere. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, this is basically a waltz. This might also be considered a waltz depending on who you ask. But for the sake of the argument, this is a waltz rhythm. But that doesn't have to be relevant. Now that we've done these and people are seeming to get it, does anyone want to have a go at 3/8 and what that means? And tell me both what that means and how many. This is a little bit tricky, but how many beats per measure that would be?
How again do you find out about the beats?
So remember, I know it's a little bit unintuitive, but whole note is 4 beats, half note is 2 beats, quarter note is 1 beat, 8th note is half a beat, 16th note is 1/4 of a beat. So using that, okay, I know this is a little bit more tricky. So before we get into the how many beats it's worth, first someone tell me what this means. What am I looking at? What does 3/8 mean in terms of this?
So it's 3/8 notes.
Yep, that's exactly what that means.
Right.
3/8 notes. Now where this gets a bit tricky is if you remember, this is worth half a beat. So 3 of them put together, you know, 3 times half. How many beats per measure are we at?
1.5.
Yep, that is correct.
Okay.
So this is where we start getting to more difficult things to think about because we're getting into half beats per measure. So this would be, again, these two, let's not even bother with this. This is a really bad example. Very impractical, but this is also a rather impractical measure. You would kind of count it as 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and we're not going to get into it. It's very impractical, but this is just a bit of an example. That being said, I'll give you guys some more practical examples. Is everyone following so far? Any questions on this? I think everyone seems to be understanding this, but if you have any questions, please ask me now because this gets even more confusing. I promise you, I wasn't the one who decided this is the way this works, but it does get more confusing when you talk about feeling a rhythm in terms of accenting. We'll get into that in a second. So any questions so far? Okay. So let me give you another example. I know I can't, let me see if I can actually draw. Is it gonna let me draw it out? Maybe? No. Okay, unfortunate. But if I had a 6/4, what does that mean? What does a 6/4 mean?
6 quarter notes.
Yep, and how many beats per measure?
6.
Yep, that is exactly correct. So like you can keep on going, you can get into weirder numbers too. The bottom number always is going to be reflective of, you know, one of these, but the top number can be whatever you want, right? Because you can also have 5/8, you can have 7/4, you can have 31/16. The top number can be anything. The bottom number has to relate to an actual type of note. So you can keep going on and pick even weirder and weirder time signatures. With that being said, I think the easiest way to explain this is that while this can get very confusing and very intricate, for most modern music, we actually only really see 2 kinds of time signatures, and that's either 4/4, which actually is called, it's so commonly used, it's called common time. So if someone says play it in common time, all they mean is play it in 4/4. And the other one that you see very common is whoever mentioned it before, the waltz. That's the other one that's very common, 3/4. And then there are variations of it. You can either do 3/2 or 6/4 or 6/8. There's different versions, but those are the very most common ones. But there are others that get even more technical and weird and things that you're not used to. It almost, many of these odd time signatures, as they're called, get to the point where it feels like you know, something's off, or that the music is cutting off or doesn't sound right. So with that being said, what I'm going to try and do is pop up a video, but I'm not sure, that is not what I want to do. I'm not sure if you guys are going to get audio. So if you don't get audio from this, then we're not going to worry about it.
You do it every year.
Audio.
Are we getting audio?
We had it until you muted it.
Well, 9/8 would mean I.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Yes? Okay,
You're
good. All right. So I'll skip through this a bit. It's a bit of a long video.
Odd time signatures can be pretty intimidating if you're.
All right. So this guy does a very good job of explaining these odd time signatures I've talked about and how they're used in some popular examples. We're just going to quickly look at some of the examples. This guy has a lot of cool resources if you're ever interested in finding him. It's part of the slides, so you can find this video.
You're new to music and music theory, but there's really nothing to be scared of. So in this video, what I want to do is talk to you about odd time signatures. What are they? How do we count them? How can we parse them? And I want to show you examples of where we hear this stuff in actual music. Throughout this entire video, as I'm giving you these examples, I'll also be...
So, for the sake of time, because we don't have much left, let me actually use his description and skip.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Which is a great example of 5/4 being used, and it's a very comfortable 5/4. There's really nothing awkward about that 5/4. What helps is you've got that nice, interesting dotted quarter note pattern.
Okay, you don't have to worry about the more intricate details that he talks about. But that being said, that's one of the good examples of a 5/4, which is not a typical, like it's an odd number. It's not a typical kind of feel that you would hear. I'll give you one more for the sake of time. There's a lot in here. But my favorite example when teaching this is Money by Pink Floyd.
5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's dealing with odd times and quarter notes. But what about when you get it?
Okay, so those are two really examples of how you can use odd time signatures, how you can find them in popular music. But generally speaking, they're avoided by most modern and popular music because they can be very jarring. But those are two very good classic examples of it being used well to the point where it's not abrasive and it gives an interesting feel to the music. The last little thing, we're actually doing fairly well on time. The last little thing relating to this form of rhythm theory I'll talk about is an actual advanced concept. Or more advanced concept. The reason I teach it is because I feel like it's very important for people who start learning rhythm theory to understand that there's more nuance to this than meets the eye. We're gonna take one little example. Okay, so I want someone. I know I'm picking on everyone today, but I just want someone to reiterate for me for the waltz for 3 or 4. How many beats per measure do we have if we're in 3/4? Someone just go for it. How many beats? So you would, for 3/4, you have 3 beats per measure, right? So it's 3 quarter notes, you have 3 beats per measure. There's another time signature that you could write that has the exact same value. And that would be 6/8. That would be 6 eighth notes. And each eighth note is half, and if you do 6 times half, that's 3. So logically speaking, you'd just be like, oh, they're literally the same, same amount of beats. That means they have to be an exactly same time signature, right? They count the same amount of time. Neither is faster or slower than the other. You would say that that's the same time signature. Where this can get confusing is that while they take up the exact same amount of time and represent, the same amount of physical, time that's passing, you could time them both. You can time a measure of 3/4 and time a measure of 6/8. They'll take up the actual same amount of time. They have what we call different feelings. Now, this is, like I keep saying, an advanced concept. So if you don't completely grasp it, that's totally fine. But you need to kind of understand that this exists. And this is something that you need to think about. When we talk about time signatures and playing notes, there's also something else we call accenting. You can accent certain notes, which come in different orders, to, to make the measure feel different. So for example, if you are to play a measure of 3/4 versus a measure of 6/8, you get 2 different feelings based on the groupings of these notes. So if my measure of 3/4 has 3 quarter notes, I could divide that further and have 6 eighth notes in a measure of 3/4. I know this is already getting a little bit confusing because you guys are new to this, but I could fit 6 eighth notes in a measure of 3/4. How we would look at this, though, is we would group them, because this is a measure of 4, we would group them in groups of 2. So if I wanted to count eighth notes in terms of 3/4, it would be 1, 2. Okay, let me use my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. However, if I wanted to do 6, 8, which takes up exactly the same amount of time, because I'm going by the 6 and it has a different feeling, that would be the same amount of 6/8 notes in that measure, but we would group them in terms of 3, and we would accent it on each of those 3. So I'll give you more practical examples in a second, but hear me out first. This would be, again, to reiterate, a measure of 3/4 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A measure of 6/8 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You see, I just went back and forth. They both take up the exact same amount of time, but feel completely different. The 6/8 is probably a better example of the waltz kind of feel, because you're feeling groups of 3 notes instead of groups of 2. Now, again, I know this is very confusing because it's an advanced concept, but I want you all just to know and understand that there's a difference. You don't need to understand completely why this is or the true mechanics behind it, but just know that 3/4 and 6/8, while they count the exact same amount of beats, that is just 3 beats per measure, they feel completely different. Now, please, if you have any questions, I am more than happy to clarify. Anyone have questions about what I just explained? All right, so with that, I normally would have some kind of like rhythm exercise in person, but since I think that would immediately turn into a big cacophony over Zoom, I think we're going to leave it there. That being said, you can find this if you click on the link. All this is using these same notes, right? And we're just using them in terms of like a practice. So for example, all of them are in 4/4. So it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just 4 beats per measure. And all you would do is you would take each of these. So for example, this is a bunch of eighth notes in a row. And you would just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then for this one, for example, you could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, something like that. These are just examples of how to read and interpret time. Any questions about rhythm stuff so far? Anything that we've done? All right. Well, you guys have seemed to manage to survive a crash course in music workshop. Now, I really do hope that this gave you guys, I know it's a lot of confusing material, but I do hope this, at least your basic takeaways, that you understand some of how music works in the basic idea. Now, if you were to take an actual course on this, like a class, they would obviously go into detail on all the concepts, but this is more of a crash course into understanding like terminology and just seeing how the basic building blocks and fundamentals of music work together. Now, obviously, if you apply rhythm theory in conjunction with all the chords and the scale stuff you've learned, then you could go on to create a song using all these concepts. With that being said, I think we're just about out of time for the workshop itself. Wow, with 1 minute spare, yeah. Any last questions about anything that's been taught today? Anything you guys want to review?
I have a question.
All right, go ahead.
So thank you very much. That was really fun. You showed us both a guitar and piano kind of music, C-based instruments, quote unquote. I don't understand why clarinet and all those other instruments aren't C-based instruments. That has always been a mystery to me.
So, okay, to dissect actually what you said, so piano is actually like legitimately a C-based, guitar is not. guitar is independent of that. You can, for two big reasons is one, you can play anything in any position and you can make it work. And two, because you can change the tuning of a guitar on the fly. In fact, this whole time, for my music, I don't actually play in standard tuning. I play in a tuning that's actually or a whole step down. So I play, on a guitar, it would be E standard is the normal tuning you play in. Everything you heard me play was actually in D standard, which is a different tuning than the normal, but it still applies to all this theory that we've learned. So
I guess maybe I meant in terms of the music, like when you see it written, what looks to me like a C note, but the different instrument isn't going to play it as a C note.
Oh, okay. So what you're asking about is more of an orchestral kind of concept. Yes, in terms of that, we have different clefs. We have a treble clef, a bass clef, and I think there's one more. I'm not an actual orchestral musician, but that's purely during music notation. They read different forms of clefs and music staff differently. In the real world, in the real application of music, they're all the same note. They're called the same thing. It's just in this very specific case that it can be very confusing that, say, a C on the piano or guitar would be an F on a bassoon, for example. But that doesn't apply so much for what we're talking about. Also, let me switch screens. But yeah, does that better explain kind of, does that answer your question? Oh, I think she disappeared.
It's probably outside of the realm of this course. It still remains a mystery to me, however.
Yeah, no, that is, yeah, something that's a little bit outside of the realms of this workshop. I think your best bet would be honestly Googling that kind of thing. You could just look up, for example, why is there a difference between bass and treble clef? But yeah, for the sake of this class, we're just looking at music theory holistically. We're not looking at it by instrument. I use my guitar because I play the guitar, but everything we learned today can be applied to any instrument. Okay. Any other questions? Any at all? Okay, so that concludes the workshop as a whole. If you have any specific or personal questions that you want to address, you can feel free to stay in the room. If not, I hope you had a good time with this workshop. From my understanding, in one of the emails you were sent by Katie, Catherine Wells, she put a link for an evaluation form, so please go fill that out. It really is helpful to me to know if you guys did, learn what I intended for you to learn, if there's something that can be improved. If you're completely clueless the whole time and feel like I need to restructure, please let me know. It's very helpful to me, so I can, when I teach this workshop in the future, I can better serve the needs of the students. So please go ahead and fill that out. But aside from that, that concludes our workshop. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Have a great night. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.